Hi, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for checking in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I hope you enjoy this video.
Well, welcome back. I guess it's been a while since we've been here. Had a lot of stuff come up in the middle of the schedule, so here we go. And what I wanted to talk about today is just some of the ancillary forms that we use on a regular basis. You know, when we're negotiating and we're in the midst of a transaction, and hopefully give you guys some clarity on using the forms in the right way and how to approach them, because I feel like we've gotten into this, and it's not just the people that are here on this call or in this office, but I think it's in general, agents have gotten to the points where we're not using forms that were meant for a specific purpose, right? So we're trying to do things on the stuff that we feel super familiar with, as opposed to what we're supposed to do right. So unless anybody has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we're going to jump right in. Okay, here we go. Okay. So what you guys should be seeing on your screen right now is an addendum. And this seems to be the go-to for every licensee. So let's first start with an addendum is an addition to whatever the document is we're talking about, whether it's a purchase agreement or a lease agreement or the transfer disclosure. These are additions to, not changes to, additions to. Okay. And so that's the way we have to look at it. And what happens is when we use addendums, the majority of the time as agents, we're using addendums incorrectly. Okay. We're using them for negotiation pieces. We're changing prices. We're asking for credits. We're doing extensions. Addendums really only are for additional space. Now, in the terms of a transfer disclosure, for example, it is a change, but it's just an addition to what already exists, right? It's not a negotiation. It's just information saying, hey, I have additional information that wasn't on there, and we're adding it too. Okay, so we're adding information. So when we think of addendum, the first three letters, add, should be our cue of how we use this. I'm adding to. Now, for the majority of the agents that use addendums, they use addendums for negotiation, which is changing, right? We're changing the terms of the agreement. That's what credits do. That's what sales prices do. All of those things that we would do. If the property didn't appraise, people are using addendums. It's not the correct form for that. So let's look at addendum would be, like I said, an additional space. And the reason why we do that, you see which form we're going to use it for. It's either the purchase agreement or a lease month to month or a rental agreement or a transfer disclosure statement. You choose which document you're using to do that. Maybe it's an SPQ, somewhere else that you may need to have additional space. The property address, the buyer, the seller's names. Buyer and tenant and seller, landlord are referred to as parties. So in all this space right here, the foregoing terms and conditions are hereby agreed to, and the undersigned acknowledge receipt of a copy of this addendum. Buyer, tenant signs it. That's all well and good. There is no expiration date to this document because it's not meant to expire, because it's an addition to an existing document that may or may not have an expiration date. It's not a change to that document. So if I were using an addendum, it would be an addendum maybe to a counteroffer where I didn't have enough room. I didn't have enough space in the counteroffer form itself, so I needed to now use this for that additional space. If I was doing an explanation maybe to the TDS, okay, maybe, in the explanation paragraphs where we go through the transfer disclosure of the SPQ and we answer that yes question, and it says we have to explain that yes. If I don't have enough space in that area that's allotted to me in the TDS or the SPQ, this is what I would use. I would put C addendum and I would write that on there. In a listing agreement, if there were some terms of a listing agreement that I didn't have enough space to put in that other terms section of the listing agreement, I would say see addendum and I would put those terms here. But under no circumstances would I negotiate here. So if I had to ask a seller for a credit, or I had to ask the seller for a price reduction, or I had to make some kind of change after we've already got an accepted offer, this is not the document I'm going to use. What I am going to use is this, the amendment of existing agreement terms. Okay? The amendment of existing agreement terms is made specifically for that negotiation piece. So if I get an appraisal that comes in $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 below, and I want to make a request of the seller to reduce that sales price from the price we agreed upon to the actual appraised value, this is the document that I would use. This is a proposal to amend, to change the purchase agreement. So addendum is to add to, amendment is to change, amend. Right? We're going to amend the purchase agreement. So our original purchase agreement, let's say the price was $700,000. Now we're going to reduce it to $675,000. We're amending the original purchase agreement, and this is the form we're going to use. And the reason why this is the right form to use, right after we fill in the property address and the dates and all of those things, we're going to write in paragraph 1 what our amendment to the purchase agreement will be. And then we get down here, which is the important part of it. This document has an expiration date. So if I'm the buyer and I'm proposing this amendment, right, I'm going to check off buyer. And at 5 p.m., 3 days after I sign this and send it to the seller, if the seller does not respond, it expires, which means if we want to negotiate this again, we'd have to redo the document. Or I can change the time and the date of the expiration. Okay, I can customize this a certain amount. Okay, now if I send this amendment, I propose this amendment to our purchase agreement, and the seller accepts it, then the seller's going to sign, date it, and return it to me. But if the seller rejects it, if the seller says, no, I'm not going to accept this change in price or this additional credit or whatever the other term is, the change, the seller is going to initial here, and they're going to date it. And vice versa. If a seller were to propose this amendment, then the buyer would initial and return it, and with a date. The reason this is important is because it doesn't just float out there. And that's my issue with all of us being so ready to use addendums, right? So, for example, let's go back to the addendum. Right? So we have a proposal. Let's say I'm the buyer and we've done our inspections. There's some little things that need to be done and we'd like to request a credit, right? Or we didn't have enough money. We overestimated we underestimated what our closing costs were going to be, and we need a little bit of help, right? So 90% of listing or of buyer's agents will grab this addendum and they're going to mark it as addendum number 1. Right? So this is addendum number 1, and we put all the information in, and we write here, seller agrees to credit $5,000 for buyer's closing costs. Okay? And then we send that out, right? We send out, a buyer signs it, we send that out to the seller. The seller gets it. Now, once the seller gets it and they say, well, absolutely not, we're not paying $5,000 in credits. The majority of the time, the response comes from the listing agent on addendum number 2. On addendum number 2. And it says, seller agrees to credit the buyer $2,000 for buyer's closing costs. I must have spelled 4. I didn't even notice that. Sorry. They say, we're going to give you 2. Okay. So the seller signs it, sends it back to the buyer's agent. Now we have an addendum number 1 signed by the buyer, an addendum number 2 signed by the seller, and neither are agreed to, but they all just float out there. Now the buyer gets this for the 2,000 and says, well, 2,000 is not going to be enough. And they do their, they crunch their numbers and they decide, okay, well, on addendum number 3, what we're going to do is we're going to ask for $3,000. Okay. Oops. We're going to ask for $3,000. So now we've got this one. This gets signed by the buyers and gets sent back to the seller. And now the seller's like, you know what? We said 2 or nothing. And you know what? Now we don't want to do any credits. So on addendum number 4, the seller decides, you know what? Just because I'm tired of this going back and forth, I'm not going to credit anything. And they send an addendum number 4 that says seller will not credit buyer for closing costs. Right? Now, technically, this is not necessary because these are all addendums and none of the previous addendums have made any changes because none of them are fully executed. But this one comes signed by the seller, right? And the buyer gets in and goes, well, no credits. Well, you know what? We liked addendum number 3 that said 2,000. We'll just go ahead and sign the 2,000. We'll figure it out. And now they sign it and they send it back. Okay. Now what? What was the actual term that was agreed upon? Because the last addendum that was signed by the seller said no credits, but the buyer didn't sign that one. The first addendum that was signed by the buyer asking for $5,000, well, that one wasn't signed by the seller, so that one's not fully executed. So by the time we get to number 2, we get to number 2, and number 2 said 2,000 signed by seller, and buyer signed it. Now we have a fully executed addendum. Now the sellers are going to be upset that somebody went back and signed something. You're going to have some issues in that transaction, whether or not that's enforceable or not, but you're still going to have a problem. Okay? Now, if I were to do that same thing on amendment of existing agreement terms as buyer, I would send number 1. And number 1 would say seller to credit. Can't type today. Credit. I can't type most days. Credit $5,000 for buyer's closing costs. Okay, we send that. Now I check the box that buyer's sending it. Buyer signs it right here. And when it gets to the seller, guess what the seller does? Well, we're not paying $5,000. We put our initials right here and date it, and now we've rejected it. So now that one can never come back to bite anybody. And so when the seller does amendment of existing agreement terms number 2, and they change that credit to 2,000, and they send it to the buyer, signed, when the buyer gets it, if the buyer doesn't like it, they can reject it. But if the buyer ignores it, it expires in 3 days, so they can't go back and re-sign it and kind of swindle the seller out of that credit. Now, whether they get that credit or not, we're using it as an example as to why there is a form that exists to do a very specific task that protects both parties from any other amendments or addendums showing up. Now, the other problem comes with escrow. Because what happens is we do addendum 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we finally agree on addendum 4, what we're going to do, and that's all we send to escrow. So what happens is escrow gets it, the lender gets it, and they're like, well, we have addendum 4, but where's addendum 1, 2, and 3? We need to see those. So now you have addendums 1, 2, and 3 that aren't fully executed, that really aren't part of the agreement, but you have to now supply them. So I've had this conversation in person tons of times with agents and trying to explain to them the importance of not using addendums to negotiate changes to the contract. So just remember, addendum, additional information to that document. Amendment, amending, changing that document. I just need you guys to start getting super clear on that. I've gotten the TCs to understand. So those of you guys that are using transaction coordinators, I would say that hopefully 100% of the time when you guys need to do this, they're using the amendments of existing agreement terms. I would assume so. It's just everybody else that's out there watching this video later or that's on this class right now that doesn't use a transaction coordinator or are transaction coordinators. You've got to get into the habit of making that change from the addendum to the amendment. Okay, so I have... what if we have already verbally agreed to an amount and we know they are going to be okay with it? Can we use this form for a credit? Don't know. I mean, look, I'm not saying that it's not enforceable, that it doesn't change the contract, but don't use it. It's not the correct document. It's not an addition to, it's an amendment of. We're changing the transaction. We're changing what we agreed to it. And that's the way we have to think about it. Anytime we're changing something we've agreed to, we've got to use that amendment of existing agreement terms. And until we all start getting into that, it's just going to be, the world is going to be out there as an addendum. Now, if you're on the flip side and you know how to do things the right way and you get an addendum that is proposing something that you don't agree with, respond on the amendment of existing agreement terms. Use the right form. Don't continue to use the wrong forms. Use the right form to respond to it. Whatever, if you're changing the terms of it. So for example, if we're looking at this addendum where the buyer's asking for, seller to credit $5,000, right? We'll put that back up there. If we receive this addendum number 1 as a listing agent, for example, set an addendum, we know that you should have done this on an amendment, but fine, I'm going to present this to my seller and say, hey, they want a credit for $5,000, and the seller says, absolutely not. What I will do is I'll credit them 3. I'm going to now go to the amendment of existing agreement terms. This will be amendment of existing agreement terms number 1. Seller will credit buyer $3,000 for buyer's closing costs, and addendum number 1, number 1 dated, whatever, today's 5/8, right? So we'll do it today, 5/8/25 is not a part of this agreement. That's it. That's how I'm going to answer. Okay? So just because somebody else does it wrong, if we know the right way to do it, we've got to try to correct it as much as possible. Okay, so we got a couple things here in the chat. Let's see. Once you amend anything, can you do an amendment to reinstate the original agreement? Of course, you could do another amendment to push things back to the way they were, to correct those. This is during escrow. Yes, this is during escrow. And yes, the amendment has a time period, has an expiration date. So you're not going to get into that thing where something is floating around and there is no resolution to it, where it's just kind of there and just hasn't been signed. Okay, questions about amendments, addendums, other questions, raise your hand, put it in the chat. I'm hoping that everybody kind of can wrap their head around it. It's the only difference between an amendment and the addendum is that it has an expiration date and it has an active rejection and active acceptance, right? And so, which is better than the addendum. So it works the same way. It has almost the same amount of space as an addendum. So I want to try to create some good habits with you guys to make sure that we're using the correct documents, okay? That we're using the proper forms, because they were built for this reason, right? So instead of us trying to put a square peg in a round hole, let's let's do things the way they were meant to be done. Okay, so if there's no questions about amendments and addendums, then I'm going to move on to our next, which has the next amount of questions or issues, which is the additional signature addendum. So if, for example, I have 3 or 4 buyers, this one will allow for us to have 3 additional signers, the additional signature addendum. So with 1 additional signature addendum, we could have up to 5 buyers on 1 contract. I know that gets a little difficult dealing with the actual RPA, because the actual RPA only allows for 4 names to go in the, in the buyer name section. But when we do that, let's just assume that there are 4 buyers, because I see that more often than not, especially now with affordability for buyers, the way things go with the interest rates where they are and prices where they are. People need, those co-borrowers on there that are going to be part of the transaction. Now, this additional signature addendum is not for adding buyers or co-borrowers after acceptance. That's not what this is for. This is for when I write my initial offer, I have 4 buyers or 3 buyers, and I need to have them actively sign the purchase agreement. Okay. If we need to add buyers after an offer has been accepted, that's going to be the next form we're going to go over, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. But let's look at the additional signature addendum right now. So additional signature addendum, this form is not an assignment. It should not be used to add new parties after a contract has been formed, just like we talked about. The persons or entities identified in paragraph 3 are additional signatories to either the residential purchase agreement, the residential listing agreement, or another document, whatever that may be that you need. Now, we're going to do it as part of the purchase agreement. The date of the purchase agreement, let's say, is today. We're going to, the property address goes in. We'll just use the office address for right now, right? Okay. This is seller. If you have the seller's name, put them in, and buyer. And the only buyer's names that are going to go in here are the additional signers. So if I have 4 signers, not all 4 names are going to go there. So in this case, the only ones that are going to go are going to be Jane Smith and John Smith, buyer. Okay. Now we're going to check off buyer here. We're going to put the name Jane Smith first. And then we're going to go down here, buyer, and we're going to put John Smith. Now, if this were also an entity thing, we would put some information down here. But right now, we're just going to keep this simple. And that's it. These are the only 2 buyers that are going to sign. Now, these initials that go here where they would initial is liquidated damages and dispute resolution. So those 2 paragraphs that are in the purchase agreement, Joe Smith and Jill Smith have already signed on the purchase agreement and initialed the purchase agreement for these 2 paragraphs. Now, this is Jane and John's opportunity to sign and to initial whether they agree or don't agree to those 2 provisions of the purchase agreement. So when you guys are going through this, it's 3, yeah. When you're using this, that's it. That's how you do it. It's I see a lot where people have all 4 buyers on there, and that's not necessary. Now, this document is only good. This additional signature addendum is only for 1 document at a time. So I've seen this sometimes, right, where somebody will put, RPA, TDS, this, right? They'll start listing out documents. It doesn't work like that. It's 1 at a time. So if you're going to use it for something other than the RPA or the listing agreement, it's 1 at a time. Now, this now becomes kind of the discretion of the listing agent, but if, for example, you have those same 4 buyers and they have to review disclosures, instead of using the additional signature addendum, which is the 100% correct way, those buyers can acknowledge directly on the disclosure, because then there's still no argument. Even if you have to add a place for a signature, add a place for an initial, it's okay if you do it that way, because otherwise you're going to have all of the documents in the transaction plus an additional signature for each one of them. Not that if you're willing to do that and your buyers are willing to do that, terrific, because it's the 100% right way. But most people will accept, especially on disclosures, that they're acknowledging it by initialing and signing it, even though there doesn't have the space for those additional 2 signatures. Now, if we're talking about an amendment of existing agreement terms that we just discussed, and you have 4 buyers, you need to do this. You need to do the additional signature addendum for that amendment, okay? Because we want to make sure that is acknowledged properly, okay? Additional signature addendum. Questions about the additional signature addendum? No? All right. You guys are getting it? Terrific. All right. So the next one that we're going to talk about here is the assignment of agreement addendum. So I had said earlier that people use assignment agreement amendment. Sorry, they changed the name. It used to be addendum, but assignment of agreement amendment. We talked about how people misuse addendums, and I've seen it where a buyer will write, buyer and seller agree that John Smith is going to be added as an additional buyer, and they'll send only that. That's not how it works. If we're adding, removing, changing the buyers, this is the document that we have to use. And the seller has to agree to that assignment. The seller doesn't have to. And especially, okay, so let's look at it this way. This is a request to do the assignment. I know in the purchase agreement it says that there's 17 days for an assignment, but that is 17 days to make the request. Nothing obligates the seller to agree to your assignment to a new buyer. So we have to keep that in mind. So as we go into a transaction, it's really important that our pre-approvals, our pre-quals, all that stuff gets done properly, because if we go in before we start writing offers and we get the buyer qualified the right way and we go through everything, do as much as we possibly can before we run out there and write offers, then we find out prior to them having to submit offers that they may need a cosigner, so that we can do those things prior to prep all that stuff prior to writing an offer, as opposed to we write an offer, get our offer accepted, then find out we need a cosigner. Then we have to ask permission of the seller to allow us to add this co-borrower onto the transaction. And if the seller doesn't agree to allow us to add the cosigner, then the deal dies. Now, I would say the majority of the time when we're doing assignments and it's just adding a cosigner, sellers usually don't push back. But here's where the issue lies, is remember, as we start to negotiate anything, then we open ourselves up for the possibility that the seller can start to negotiate other terms or can say no to that request and put us in a position where we may have to back out. So let's say, for example, I write my offer, I get my offer accepted, and then I find out that I have to add a cosigner because something changed or we didn't pre-qual properly. And in the time that I got my offer accepted, the seller got a better offer. They got a backup offer that they thought was better, and I'll show you the next form. They created a backup offer addendum, and they got somebody to be a backup offer. And now they can't cancel on me because I'm performing, but now I ask for this assignment request. And I say, I need this cosigner. And they find their loophole to get rid of me. And they say, no, we won't agree to it. And they have every right to do that. And then they don't. I can't qualify without the cosigner. I can't get the cosigner without adding them to the transaction. The deal falls apart, and they get to move on to next buyer. That's why it's so important. You know, it's funny is that I get to hear the lenders in here that are helping you guys, and I hear them tell you, please don't show them property yet. We're not finished with the pre-qual. And you guys are out there showing property without knowing 100% that your buyers are able to purchase. You're guessing, you're hoping, you're going off of maybe that first surfacey phone call with the lender where they go, yeah, looking at your income and this and that. You don't wait for your buyer to have actual buying power, and you put yourself in a really horrible position with your buyer because they get disappointed and there's no coming back from that disappointment because you jumped the gun. So it's really important that we follow the entire process and do things in the right steps. And that's what I've been working on. And we'll do a class later, probably in June, about the actual buyer process. Okay. But let's say we did everything the right way and something changed during the qualification after the agreement was accepted, and we have to do this assignment of agreement amendment. This is what we're going to do. So we're adding a co-borrower. So this is a conditions that are going to be added to the purchase agreement, right? Made part of the purchase agreement. We're going to put the date of the purchase agreement. We're going to put the buyer and seller's names. We're going to put the address. And if we're adding somebody, we're going to do partial assignment. Okay? Partial assignment, adding a buyer. A buyer is adding the assignee's name below to the agreement and granting to such assignees a partial interest in the agreement. So now we've got, our buyer is John Smith, right? And he's going to have to, I don't know who Bill Jones is the seller, whatever. Right. Oh, sorry. I didn't skip down to seller, did I? I did both of these as buyers. See, not paying attention. See what happens when you don't pay attention. So now we got those two, or the John Smith is the buyer, and he needs to add somebody as a co-borrower. So he's going to add his cousin, Jack Smith, to the transaction as the assignee. Right? He's adding him on to the purchase because I need him now to be a borrower. Now, if, for example, and we'll get into the next one, we'll talk about different kinds of transfers. What happens is now that assignee has to go through all of the previous documents. Okay? They have to go through all the previous documents. So the default of this document says prior documents have already been given to the assignee. Assignee acknowledges that buyer has already provided assignee all prior documents. So any disclosures that may have been delivered already, the purchase agreement, all of that stuff. Or if you haven't done that yet, then you could check this box and say they haven't seen any of that stuff. Now, this pre-qualification or pre-approval of assignees, assignee has been pre-qualified or pre-approved by buyer's lender as per the agreement, and a copy is attached. This requirement applies even if 1E is checked. So, and we'll get into that. So now you got to get that new pre-qual letter from the lender that shows that it's got John and Jack Smith both on there as being approved to purchase the property. Now, default again, time to return assignee initialed prior documents. Initial copies of all prior documents are attached to this assignment. So if you have those ready, you can leave it alone and send it with the assignment request. If they haven't, then you would check this box and say, hey, assignee is going to get those to you within 3 days of you accepting this assignment agreement. Okay? Effective failure to return or attach documents. Seller, after first delivering a notice to buyer to perform, may cancel this agreement, and the assignment shall have no further force and effect. Prior documents. If assignee does not deliver to seller all prior documents within the time specified in 2C, pre-qualification or pre-approval of assignee does not attach the same pre-qualification or pre-approval form buyer's lender as required by buyer. Okay, so again, you got to follow timelines just like you would in the purchase agreement. All of those things have to be delivered back to the seller so the seller knows, yes, they've already seen and acknowledged and are moving forward with the condition of the property. Next, consideration for assignment. That doesn't apply in this case, and we're going to talk about what case that would apply in next. But once everybody agrees, the buyer would sign here, and the assignee is going to sign here saying, yes, I want to be added to the transaction. Okay? Now, if we send this to the seller and the seller says, yeah, we're good with the assignment, we're going to go ahead and allow you to add this buyer, then they'll sign and return it. If they're not, they're going to reject it by initialing here and put the date that it wasn't accepted. Okay. Now remember, the seller has no obligation to accept this assignment. But this is the right way to do the assignment. I see on addendums and even on amendments where they're at least trying to use a better form, where they're requesting that change in that assignment, and that's not the proper way to do it. Okay, so that's the most common way that we would use an assignment of agreement. Okay, that would be the most common way. Now let's go back and let's redo it again. Okay, so let's say now we have a total assignment. Okay, total assignment. New buyers replaces all original buyers. Buyers assigning all of buyers' interests in this agreement to the assignee's name below. Now, that's me assigning it to. I'm out. I got the offer accepted, but now I'm stepping out and somebody else is stepping in. Not super common. The most common way that you would see that, and the realistic thing that would happen would be, I wrote this offer as an individual, but now I would rather purchase it as my trust. So let's say we're doing a total assignment and I want to put it in my trust. So John Smith wrote this offer, so now it's the John Smith Family Trust. Now we're transferring it from John Smith the loan to John Smith Family Trust. And then I will check this box right here. Okay? Because it is my own trust. I own that trust. So I can go ahead and say, I want to transfer it into my trust. Obviously I've already gotten, if I'm the one that's signing on behalf, I've already gotten all of those things. I've already initialed all the copies, right? There's no consideration, and we're going to talk about consideration next. And now it's an entity assignee, right? So the full entity name is, again, we're going to put the John Smith Family Trust, right? Is now the new assignee, and John Smith is the legally authorized signer. So now when we get down here, you see the buyer is signing as John Smith. I'm going to sign it once, and then I'm going to go down here and sign it again as John Smith because I'm the title as the trustee. And that's the proper way to move the property from my individual purchase into my trust purchasing the property. Okay? Now, the next thing that happens with assignments is what people like to call, I'm going to get rid of this stuff right now, what people would like to call wholesaling. Okay, so I got to get rid of all this stuff, sorry. So now let's go back up here again to total assignment. So I bought it. I'm John Smith. Now, when we look at these things, when we look at what people say wholesaling, right? What happens a lot of times is an agent. So let's say that John Smith is an agent. So John Smith went and found a deal that he thought was a great investment for somebody, but maybe not for him, right? So what John Smith does is he goes, writes the offer, gets the offer accepted, and when he starts pitching it to his group of investors, he finds another investor that wants to buy it, and it turns out that it's Jim Brown is the one that wants to buy it. Now that's an investor that wants to buy it. So generally when we look at these wholesales, what happens is that buyer buys it, finds another investor to take it off his hands, and they usually make a little money off it, right? So I bought this property for $400,000. Jim Brown's going to buy it from me for, $475,000. And so I'm going to make that transfer. What happens a lot of times, and probably most of these are going to be checked off because they haven't looked at the documents yet. What happens is in these wholesale cases, the buyers don't disclose to the seller that they're being compensated. So that's what this is. So the default is buyer has not received and will not receive any monetary consideration from assignee for this assignment. But in these cases, in wholesale cases, what they call wholesaling is the buyer has received something, and you are required to disclose the amount of money that you are receiving from the assignee for this assignment, whether you're getting it now or you're getting it after the close of escrow. You have to disclose that as assignee. If you don't, now you've committed fraud. And so that's where I start to look at the dangers of these wholesalers is, are they disclosing to the sellers the money that they're making when they're transferring it to somebody else? That's a whole other thing. That's just opinions. But this is the right way to do it. So if I was doing it, let's say that I was only going to make $5,000, right, for the transfer. He's going to give me $5,000, a little finder's fee, so that he could purchase it because it's still a good deal. I still have to tell the seller that this is happening, and the seller still has the right to allow this or to deny this, just like they would any other thing, any other assignment. Now, if you think about it realistically, from a seller's perspective, if I got my offer accepted at $450, and now I'm basically going to sell it for $455. If I see this as seller, wouldn't a seller believe that they should get that extra $5,000? Why didn't you buy it for $455 if you knew somebody that was willing to do that? Because that's basically what happened. Now, I'm sure there are sellers out there that are like, great, thank you for finding somebody to get it off my hands. I just wanted to be done with it. And if a seller signs and accepts this, they can't come back and say, well, wait a minute, why didn't we get that $5,000? They knew what they were doing. They agreed to it. Okay. So as long as we're clear, as long as we disclose everything and the seller does agree to it, terrific. I find it, difficult to believe that all of those transfers that are being assigned that have some kind of, consideration for that assignment are all being disclosed to the seller. Now let's look at the last one. The last one is replacing a buyer. So if we had, let's say originally this was John and Jane, right? So they had two buyers already. And then Jane, his sister, says, you know what, I can't do it. So what we're going to do is we have to get her out. So we're going to replace Jane Smith here. And we're going to replace her with Jack Smith, the brother, to help him. And maybe we could check off the boxes if they didn't. If they've already got the prior documents and we've already got them initialed and ready to send back, we'll leave them as default. There was no consideration. We're just replacing one buyer with another. In this case, John has to sign and Jane has to sign to agree to be replaced. And then Jack will sign to agree to be the assignee. Okay? So those are the ways. Partial assignment, I got to add a co-borrower. Total assignment, everybody's getting replaced. We're giving it to a whole new buyer or putting it into a different entity maybe. And finally, the other assignment where we're replacing somebody that was already on track, right? We had somebody, we had two buyers. One buyer wants to step out, another buyer wants to step in. That's the other assignment. Any questions? Anybody have questions about this? So remember, if you have to do this, if you have to add somebody, have to remove somebody, have to change it into a trust, this is the way we're doing it. We're not doing it on an amendment. We're not doing it on an addendum. This is the document we're going to use. Oh, Alba's got her hand up. Be right there, Alba. Go ahead.
Hi, Kyle.
Hello.
So this would also apply to, when you say entity, it also applies to like a corporation, not just a trust or anything else, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So if I bought it as my personal, I said, oh, well, I want to put it in, Kyle Estrada Incorporated. Yes. Same thing. Same thing right here. I would just check the box that the assignee is buyer's own trust or wholly owned entity, and we would move on from there. That's it. Yeah. So exactly.
If it's two different corporations, the same thing, like John Smith Incorporated, Jane Smith Business LLC or whatever.
Same thing. It would be here. Yeah. We would go down here to the entity buyers down here where the signatures are. You're right. Entity assignee. and we would put those two entities and the two names right here,
Oh,
and they would
got
go
it.
there. Yeah,
Okay. Thank you so much.
you're welcome. Anybody else? Any other questions about the assignment of agreement addendum? No? Okay. And then let's go here to the backup offer addendum. And this is one that doesn't get used much at all. So this is really more for the listing agent. I know I've had conversations with buyer's agents where the listing agent has asked them to provide this. The problem is that we don't really know the terms of the other agreement, right? And so we'll talk about that right now. So this is an addendum to the purchase agreement or to a counteroffer, right? Because what it could be is an addendum to the counteroffer, additional information to the counteroffer. So the seller maybe is adding this as a counter. It's not to the purchase agreement because it hasn't been incorporated in the purchase agreement. Now, if I'm a buyer's agent and I had a conversation with the listing agent said, hey, listen, submit your offer. I'm going to make you backup number one. I can then ask him questions about this backup offer addendum, and I can include it with my RPA. But the majority of the time, it's going to be something that's going to come back to me as a counteroffer, right? So this is part of, counteroffer number one, and whatever the date of that is. Let's say it's today for the date today, right? It's dated today, and then we have, John again, and them again, and we have the bill again, right? Okay, so we got everything in there. So this says the agreement is in backup position number 1 or 2, whatever it may be. So if I'm countering people, maybe as a listing agent, I got 2 offers that are great, right? And so I said, okay, or I got 3 offers that are great, and I accepted one, and the other 2, I want to keep them around because maybe number 1 is a little shaky. It's good, but well, we're not 100% sure, and these guys were so close, I want to keep them. So let's just say that, John and Jane are a backup number 1. Okay, so they're backup number 1. Is contingent upon a written cancellation and any prior contracts and related escrows between seller and other buyers, and mutual release of the obligation to buy, sell, or exchange that property. Seller and other buyers may mutually agree to modify or amend the terms terms of prior transactions. So what it's saying is, hey, you're number 1 and I'm accepting your offer. This is basically when I send this back to you, if you agree to it, I'm accepting your offer subject to the cancellation of the offer I've already accepted. So you're accepted. Okay? But what it says is I don't have to cancel that one. We could change the terms of this first one and not have to cancel just to go with you. Okay, that's what it's saying. Cancellation rights. For buyer may cancel the agreement in writing at any time before seller provides buyer copies of written cancellation and releases of prior transactions signed by all parties to those contracts. So I'm accepted with you, but we're not in escrow. And any time before you send me the cancellation of the escrow that you have, I can send you a cancellation of my agreement and move on, so I won't be backup number 1 any longer. Okay? For buyer or seller, if seller is unable to provide such written signed cancellations and releases to buyer by, and then you would pick a date. Now, what I would suggest as a date would be the contingency periods of the offer that I'm actually in escrow on. So if that offer was accepted on the 8th, right? What's 17 days from there? 7, 14. So what are we, around the 27th? Let's say the 27th. So if by May 27th you haven't sent me cancellations, either party can cancel. Right? We could the seller can come back and say it's the 27th. We haven't canceled. Sorry, here's cancellation. We're canceled. You're not a backup offer anymore. Fair. Or the buyer could say, hey, seller, it's 27th. Have you gotten this cancellation? No? Okay, well, then here's our cancellation. We're not going to be your backup offer any longer. Okay? That's what happens on that day. Now, buyer's deposit. Pay attention. Shall be delivered to escrow holder within 3 business days after copies of the written cancellation and releases signed by all parties to prior transaction are provided to buyer. So, if on the 27th we get that cancellation, We get all the proof of cancellation. By the 30th, my deposit would have to be in escrow. Because I'm number one, I get to go. Okay? Or, I don't know why anybody would do this. You could check it and say, my deposit's going to go in right now. I'm willing. This is how I'm so committed to being your backup offer. I'm going to put my deposit in. I don't know who would do that, but you could. Okay? So it's a choice. Time periods for the agreement. Time periods in the agreement for investigations, contingencies, covenants, and other obligations shall begin on the day after seller provides buyers copies of signed cancellations and releases of prior transaction. So, again, once you get that cancellation, so if I get the cancellation information today, day one is tomorrow. So if we have 17 days, that day one starts tomorrow. Or, again, you could check the box. I don't know who would do this without knowing the offer was going to be canceled, but you could make all the time periods start immediately. Okay? I don't suggest that to anybody ever. The parties agree that no real estate broker agent involved in this transaction has advised either party whether the prior transaction was legally canceled or if that party is legally entitled to the deposit. It has nothing to do with this. Expiration. If this backup offer is attached to a purchase agreement or counteroffer, it expires with that other document. Otherwise, this backup offer shall be deemed revoked unless signed and delivered back to the party initiating it by 5 p.m. on the third day after it is signed by seller. So if it was on its own, not sent with a counter or not sent with the purchase agreement, and we sent it after the fact, it would have its own expiration date. Okay, seller signs, buyer signs if they agree to it. Seller acknowledges this is notice of cancellation and release of prior transactions. Seller acknowledges being advised to seek the advice of qualified California real estate attorney regarding the cancellation of all prior transactions. Seller hereby delivers notice to buyer that all prior transactions have been canceled and released. Attached hereto are copies of the signed cancellation and release of prior transaction. The agreement is now in full force and effect, and so now the seller signs here again. That's when that other one cancels. When the seller gets it or the buyer gets it, they're going to initial here acknowledging that they received it, and now all our time periods are going to start. Okay? Questions about the backup offer? Anybody? Any questions? So, if you are a listing agent and you're going to tell people that they are a backup offer, please try to use this as much as possible. Now, if I'm backup number one and the seller sends me the cancellation, notice of cancellation, and I send back and say, call him back and say, nah, we don't want it, then he would move on to backup offer number two if that were the case. And then the nice thing about this is everything is done. Now, when we do this, you should have countered already, had all the things agreed upon, everything ready to go. So that way what happens is escrow number one cancels, escrow number two opens right away. That's just how it works. What happens is most agents are saying, oh, I'm going to keep you as a backup offer, but they never counter them. They just call them and say, no, we didn't accept your offer, but I'm going to hold on to it as a backup. And now their escrow falls out, and then I have to turn around and call Andy and say, Andy, do your buyers still want it? And they're like, yeah. Well, now I have an expired offer, so what are my choices? Do I ask Andy to write a brand new offer, or do I counter an offer that is now 17 days old? It doesn't make sense because now I make the counter. What happens if Andy goes, because I've told my seller, hey, don't worry, I've got a couple backup offers. But now I counter Andy with the terms that he didn't know I was going to counter because I didn't encounter him 2 weeks ago. And his buyers go, absolutely not. We're not taking that. So now backup offer number one is out. So now I got to call the guy that was number two, and I call Angel. I'm like, Angel, are you guys still interested? I'm going to send you a counter offer. And then his buyers are like, nah, we don't dig that. We're out. And now what I told my seller was I had backup offers, and now I have nothing. So now we're back up on the market. If we do it this way, I've already countered. Everybody's already agreed to all of the terms. They understand what they've agreed to. And so that way, when I call up Andy and say, Andy, you're my backup number one, I'm going to go ahead and open escrow. Are you guys good? He can go, oh, man, I'm sorry. I meant to send you cancellation. We found another property. Great, terrific. Now I can go to Angel and go, Angel, you're number two. Are you guys ready to go? Number one backed out. Yeah, we're good. All right, I open escrow tomorrow because we don't have to reset terms. I don't have to negotiate again. So keep that in mind as you guys as listing agents when you're thinking about how we're going to negotiate contracts and hold on to backup offers. Okay? Okay, any questions? Yes, it looks like that is Virginia. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Kyle, I got in a little late, but on the agreements or the changes, of adding and taking out, is that done during the contingency period only, or can it be done even after we've removed all contingencies?
It can be done. The thing is that this, like, for 17 days in the contract, and it says in the RPA, I have 17 days to make that request, and the seller has to at least acknowledge that request. After 17 days, I could ignore your request. Technically. Now, most people aren't going to do that, but technically, yes, I could ignore it because it's outside of the time period, So, but yes, you could still negotiate that assignment after the fact. There's not an issue. And there's no change to your contingencies, no change to time periods. It doesn't give them a right to cancel, none of that stuff. It's just we're adding or removing. Okay. One other thing real quick, just extension of time. I'll get your question in just a second, Alba, and let me get through this extension of time addendum real quick. Extension of time addendum. Look, it does have additional terms on here that you can add things. My suggestion is if you're going to do something that is very detailed or in depth or is connected to a lot of different things, I would maybe attach an extension of time addendum, but do those negotiations on amendment. Like if this is subject to a counteroffer being removed or to a contingency being removed or or there's money as part of the extension of time, I would tie this extension of time amendment to an assignment of agreement amendment. An amendment of existing agreement terms. Sorry, I'm confusing myself with all the amendments and addendums. So you use this for an extension of the escrow. So whatever you're going to change your close date, do you change it? For an extension of a contingency, the date and which contingency you're going to extend. Any other time periods that you may need an extension for, any terms of that. This now expires again, has an expiration date of 3 days after it was signed at 5 p.m. Now, just as advice on extensions, if you need an extension, don't wait until the time period passes to ask for the extension. Try to do it. If you can see on the horizon that you're not going to make that time period, do the extension as early as possible. It's going to increase your chances that the seller is going to be okay with that, or the listing agent is going to be okay with that extension. Once we're past the time period and we're asking for an extension, it generally becomes a little bit more difficult to get that acceptance. Now, do remember, like I said, anytime we negotiate one thing that we've already agreed upon in the RPA, everything is open for negotiation. So if I need an extension for a close of escrow, right, and I send that extension in, the seller can put conditions on that extension, such as a per diem, charging you an amount of money per day until you close escrow. They can remove any credits. They can rescind credits that were given to you. They can adjust the compensation they agreed to pay your buyer's agent. A lot of things can change just based on extensions, and that's why I say the earlier I can negotiate an extension where it seems like it makes sense and I'm being proactive as opposed to reactive to a notice to perform or something like that, the better chance I have of getting those extensions accepted without it changing the terms of our agreement. And usually that's where people get put into a bad position, is that if they don't get that extension, they have to give up something, credits or commissions or things like that. Okay, so that is the class for today. We will not be having one next Thursday. There's something in the way, but we'll be back again on the 22nd. Does anybody have any questions about anything before I let you guys go? How often do you hear a seller or selling agent asking for compensation for an extension? Happens all the time. We've had commissions. We've had compensation reduced on a few transactions because they asked for an extension. A lot of times it turns out to be the second extension, not the first, when the listing agent and the seller are frustrated. They're cutting it by a half a point or sometimes a point. They're reducing closing cost credits by an amount, or they're charging per diems. I can't say that there's an actual common number that happens, but it is happening. And so that's why I say it's really important that you guys understand time periods, because not only when I have to get an extension am I putting all those things at risk, I'm sometimes putting my buyer's deposit at risk too. Albie, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, Kyle, maybe you said it and I missed it, but up to how many backup offers is the seller allowed to have?
I
As
mean,
many as they want?
that's yeah. You could have. It's up to you if you want to go through all that paperwork. But yeah,
Yeah.
you could have as many as you want. I mean,
Okay.
I would legitimately, I would say that it doesn't make sense to have more than two, maybe
Okay.
three max. Because to be honest, why am I going through all the paperwork of 4, 5, 6, and 7 when the chances of me getting to that number on a backup offer, it seems kind of crazy. But you never know. You never know. But yes, there is no limit. It's just the limit of how much time you want to spend on paperwork.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, guys, I appreciate it. If you missed any part of this, it's going to be on YouTube later today in the afternoon. If you know somebody that should have been on here and wasn't, please send them to the YouTube channel. And again, if you have agents out there that you guys know that need help and they're not getting it somewhere else, please send them to my channel. Like it, subscribe it, share it, do all that stuff. I appreciate you all. I'll talk to you soon. Be good and be productive.